Hey, good morning, everyone. Okay, so we're going to have some reflections on the referendum, which we kind of comprehensively lost in all the states and territories other than ACT. We had been tracking 60-40 for the last 4 or 5 years. And then the decisive thing happened when the National Party decided they were going no, which was followed by the Liberal Party. And there's basically a line that goes the no vote going that way and the yes vote going that way, and we flipped the percentages. In retrospect, there was probably nothing we could do in the campaign to turn that around. Once we lost the bipartisanship, it meant that we were going to lose. The crucial thing is to try to keep the electorate on board, and that 15 of the last 15 years. And then it's November, the National Party broke on us. And no matter what we did, we just couldn't turn the tide around. It meant that all the negative campaigning that was happening in social media in particular, but was licensed by the two parties. And those three dynamics, one, the old racism, two, and Kerry and I and the other campaigners saw it on the campaign trail every day. A kind of willful ignorance. Yeah, if you don't know, but no. And the third dynamic, just mean-spiritedness, right? There was a license to be mean about this. And it is, unfortunately, a default position in Australia to be mean-spirited about blackfellas. One of the most striking things in the polls was most Australians don't believe Indigenous people are disadvantaged. It's just the most amazing thing. But over the years, Australians have come to view Indigenous people as basically having been given a fair go. So that was very surprising to me and everybody else, that the average Australian believes Indigenous people get a fair go. So no appealing to a fair go was really working for us. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, but the cost of living thing became a big issue. We were being told health, education, foreign affairs, whatever. And right down the bottom was Indigenous affairs and the voice. That's always the case, though. You know, when you ask Australians to prioritise what's of concern to them, that's what they always tell. Indigenous affairs is way down. It's usually the last thing. But of course, with cost of living, trial cost of living in Araku or Lockhart or Hopevale or wherever, just no sense that the cost of food and everything else and services versus the levels of income. We're about a third the income with 3 times the prices. So no kind of awareness amongst the voters that voted no that, yeah, cost of living is biting everybody, but it's biting remote communities even more severely. And we just couldn't penetrate with that. The loss of bipartisanship, you know, we could never get the LNP over 14 years to own the bloody thing. We kept it alive while they were in government. I had to do a lot of crawling on my knees to keep it alive, and other leaders. But we eventually lost him in November, right? Before the model was announced, the National Party decided they're going to go no. Of course, it was Jacinta's emergence, entry into the parliament, that forced the Nationals to take a stand. But they rushed to take a stand in November because Barnaby was, nobody knows the story, Barnaby was going to make another tilt for the leadership against Littleproud. And Littleproud and his so-called moderate Nationals locked in behind Jacinta because Barnaby was going to make the voice and the National Party's response to it an issue in a leadership challenge to Littleproud. So a whole lot of National MPs who had previously been supportive of the voice and with whom we'd done a lot of spade work over the years, all of a sudden we lost that. Because they were all locking behind Littleproud against a potential move from Barnaby against Littleproud for failing to support Jacinta. That's the politics, the behind the scene politics of why we lost the National Party last November. And then, of course, with the National Party gone, it was only a matter of time before the Liberals decided to say no. And once we lost them, no matter what we did in the campaign, it wasn't going to work. There was hope amongst Indigenous leaders and the Labor Party, or the Labor leadership, Prime Minister Down. There was a hope that maybe this time it's going to be different, and that maybe it's possible to win a referendum just with Labor, just with one side. That maybe for the first time we'll change the Constitution without bipartisanship. And the answer we had the answer. The Constitution will never change without bipartisanship. So we spent a lot of money, time, effort on a lost cause, really. You know, there's a lot of errors and weaknesses in the campaign, as there is in any campaign. But had we run the most perfect campaign, I don't think we could have changed the outcome once we lost the Liberals and the National Party. Going around the countryside, Kerry and I had a lot of fun. Hey? Is that what we call it? And we would see a lot of people, a lot of evidence that the progressive no, the Aboriginal and lefty kind of progressive no, was hurting our vote. So many places. It was being used, yeah. Oh, look, your people don't want this. I think it was a big suppression of the vote, the progressive no position. It hurt us quite a bit. A lot of university Indigenous studies centres were against us. Majority of them. We'd go to events on university campuses, and there'd be a big mob of white fellas there, no black fellas. And I'd ask questions, oh, what about the study centre? And people say, oh no, they're against the voice. So there was a big, and medical services, Indigenous medical services, and other organisations, a lot of them were either actively against or kind of, we're going to wait and see what happens. The only place that was consistent in support were remote communities. But in any town or city that Kerry and I went to, and other campaigners, there was this lack of ownership on the part of too many urban-based Indigenous organisations. The so-called community-controlled sector was missing in action. The churches, the best they did was to say, well, leave it to your conscience, make your own choice. And that just was never going to help us. We needed the churches to take a moral stand on our behalf, and they didn't. I think other than the Uniting Church, maybe, all the churches, my own church. I told my church we had more Muslims voting for us than you guys. You know, after 140 years of association with that church, they ended up being a big no vote, Peter. Really, your church? And I tried to get on to the heads of our church. And while the bishop was in support, he never had the courage to take a stand. And that was the case across all the churches. Ethnic groups, you know, there was strong support from Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Arab, lots of ethnic groups were behind us, Sikhs. But there was a limit to it. A lot of them were very susceptible to these social media campaigns, saying that you'd lose your backyards if you voted for the Voice, that there'd be extra taxes if you voted for the Voice, and so on. And what kind of we witnessed was at a certain point, whilst there were very active and passionate percentages of ethnic groups, I don't know what percentage of them fell into the other group that voted no. And a lot of the sentiment, well, what's in it for us? What do we get out of this? And that was a big sentiment amongst ethnic groups, that they wanted to know what was in it for them if they voted yes. So I think by the time people do an analysis of the vote and try to work out who voted how, I think the picture in Western Sydney and places like that tells us that many ethnic groups voted against us. Marcia Langton wrote a paper about 15 years ago saying there's a kind of demographic problem, which is the more people born overseas, the less sympathetic they will be to our plight. So John Taylor and Marcia wrote about this, anticipating that it's going to become harder and harder with people who feel that, well, I've got no responsibility for this. And what about me? I don't think Marcia's remembered her paper, but I certainly do, that new Australians are increasingly unconcerned about Aboriginal people. The same-sex marriage community, I don't know that we got half of them. They certainly didn't campaign very hard for us. So they secured their recognition 5 years ago, but never came out to support our recognition. And in fact, were key figures in the business community and so on that were kind of talking against us. So we couldn't even rely on the empathy of those who fought for same-sex marriage to support our campaign. Queensland was really bad. Not once did the Premier come out in support of the campaign, not once. And of course, you might have heard her after the referendum saying, you know, the great Queensland people have, the wisdom of the great Queensland people came out in the referendum. Never lifted a finger. But we made a lot of mistakes too. I don't think any of those mistakes were decisive. The cruel fact is that once the Liberals and the Nationals went against us, we weren't going to win. So the conclusion has to be, there's no way the Constitution's going to change. Not now, not in 50 years' time. Queensland was really bad, 70-30 it was. And Brisbane was really bad. You know, people were telling us we should be 50-50 in Brisbane. I don't think we got that anywhere near that. So Brisbane was very bad. You go down on South Bank and you're seeing all these well-off people and they're just not sympathetic to the voice. And it's still a big country town, Brisbane. So, you know, the conclusion has to be there will be no constitutional reform. One of the biggest problems we had was an inability to answer Jacinta. And I've always maintained Jacinta was just a puppet of the right. The real drivers of the anti-voice campaign were the Institute of Public Affairs, which is a small but very loud right-wing think tank in Collins Street, Sydney, Melbourne, and the Centre for Independent Studies in Macquarie Street, Sydney. Jacinta had been an intern at the CIS for about 4 years, 5 years. And Warren and Jacinta had been cultivated for this role for a long time. Janet Albrooksen's piece 2 weekends ago in The Australian, Janet's really the driver on behalf of the IPA. And she says in this piece, we needed a Jacinta. It was a very revealing piece that kind of divulged more than she should have divulged, which said that they very deliberately went to find a person like Jacinta to front their campaign. This has always been the history of Indigenous people in the country. And it's a colonial mechanism. If you want to fight the blackfellas, put the blackfella in the front of your campaign. And this is what they did. And Australians, it indulged Australian fantasies. You know, you don't have to be the one saying that colonisation wasn't so bad. You get a blackfella to say it. And Australians loved that, I think. They love absolution. But they can't claim it themselves. They need a black surrogate to do it. And we were strangely unable to answer that. In a campaign sense, you couldn't, because the minute you did, you'd cause a massive eruption. And they played on that. They knew we couldn't challenge the fact that they had two surrogates in front of them. It's the way they disrupted societies in Africa, the subcontinent and so on, over centuries. Okay. So we've ended up not back where we started, but we've ended up on the back foot, where our cause is set back. And the LNP are going to keep driving this. They're going to do it until the next federal election. Most of you are too young to know that when they first came to power again in 1996, after 12 years of Labor, their first press conference in 1996 was to announce an audit of ATSIC, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. John Howard's first press conference was directed at an audit. Guess what they're talking about now? An audit. Not one person was charged with malfeasance in 1996. Not one. And yet the Prime Minister of the day chose as his first press conference an audit into Indigenous spending. And so this is what's happened now again, banging on about a Royal Commission into auditing Indigenous organisations. The second thing that they're doing is they're trying to cement in the minds of Australians the association between the Labor Party, Indigenous leadership, and the sexual abuse of children. This is an old tactic from the United States. In 1988, the Republican candidate for president, George H.W. Bush, the father, he ran a campaign against the Democrat on a guy called Willie Horton. Willie Horton was an African American who'd been put out on release from prison, and he committed rapes, went back to jail. And George H.W. Bush used Willie Horton as the image of Black America and the Democrats. And he won the election on that basis. I believe what the NP are doing is they're selling us with child sexual abuse and using that as a way to penetrate the minds of all Australians, that those who are refusing an Royal Commission into child abuse are protecting pedophiles and so on. And they're going to run till election day on this. The strategy is to make child abusers the running mate of Albanese and Labor Party. Dutton was banging on about it before the referendum campaign and then stopped. They only started talking about it in the last 3 weeks again. For months and months, he'd stopped talking about having a Royal Commission. He'd stopped because I'd challenged him in Arnhem Land in February when I went over for a meeting there. I said, why didn't the Royal Commission into institutional abuse cover what you're concerned about? Because we'd spend $1 billion on that Royal Commission. They were worried about child abuse in communities. Why didn't that $1 billion inquiry cover that? I said, if it missed out on Indigenous communities, you were a member of the cabinet at the time. Why didn't you and your government intervene to make sure it investigated things in Indigenous communities? He's kind of got no answer to that. And I said, not only that, most of these communities, a lot of these communities were Catholic and run by other churches. And then 3 weeks ago, the Bishop of Kimberley is reported to be under investigation by the Vatican for historic child abuse. The Bishop. Is Dutton interested in that? So they've now revived that because they know it's going to be so potent. How many people have you heard of who are asking about child abuse? And why are Labor and the Greens and Pocock blocking a Royal Commission into child abuse? So we were on the back foot. We're going to be on the back foot for a while, but we keep going. I want to thank everyone who contributed to the campaign over many years, but particularly this year. Thank you very much for your work and your dedication. What's the upside? Well, the upside is almost 60% voted against us, or over 60%, and almost 40% voted with us, which is how many voters? Almost 6 million voters went with us. That's a glass half full way of looking at it, that we have 6 million supporters that represent 40% of Australian voters. And we have 60,000 volunteers across the country, the very largest group of volunteers of any political party. No political party has 60,000 people signed up, ready to man the polling booths, ready to go into shopping centres, train stations, the streets, knock on doors. So those are the two positives, I think. 60,000 volunteers and 6 million voters, representing almost 40% of the Australian electorate. The Labor Party won government last year on 33% of voters. And the LNP got 23%. And one National Party got, I don't know, 5% or something. One Nation, 5%. We got 40%. So we've got to think about what's to be done with that level of support. And the people who are so passionate, so much behind us, versus the support for the major political parties will never, ever go above 35%, I think, ever again. The days when the major political parties got plus 40% are over, and they'll only ever get 30, 35%. So our level of support exceeds the level of support given to the Labor Party, and certainly to the Liberals. So we need to have a think about that and what our next plan B is. What else, Kerry?
I think it's really important to remember the friendships that have been forged at the baggage carousels, the African communities in Brisbane. We spent, we're on a bus. I'm not sure if you've read about Amar Singh. He, one of the Australians of the Year, who got himself a truck and travelled around Australia spreading the word. So we jumped in the car. I think you agreed to this just so that I couldn't hire a car and do the driving. It was actually a ploy. Anyway, so we spent days with Amar in Western Sydney with the migrant communities. We went to many, many temples with many hundreds of people. And yeah, many, many friendships forged, I would say, even in Brisbane. And those 6 million people are very, very passionate 6 million people who, when they confront Noel as like a rock star at the baggage carousels and in the airports, that when they would say thanks very much for what you were doing, because they could see the big vision to bring Australia together, that they would cry. And, you know, they were very passionate and emotional, whereas I see the 60% as not even knowing that there was a referendum. Like at least 30% of people that went in to vote had no idea that there was a referendum. Oh, we've got to vote today, don't we have a fine? So what is this all about? But the almost 6 million people are so very passionate, and those 60,000 volunteers, so many whom had never ever campaigned in their life, were out there letterboxing, walking malls, you know, placarding, had signs on their houses, wearing the T-shirts, so passionate about bringing Australia together around recognition. So there were so many amazing moments, apart from Noel losing 4 jackets, 5 sets of headphones. Yeah, I would, because I was sitting in a different part of the plane, but I would walk out down the aisle and there would be like crumbs. There would be the provision card, you know, the card that had fallen out of his pockets, and then cards down the aisle.
You gave them an inch and they... Anyway, I'm going to tell a story against her now. Tomo was in the back seat straight, and we're approaching now from North Sydney down to the bridge. Late at night, Kerry's driving. And we come to this bloody little concrete curb that went one way out and we would have had the biggest accident on Sydney Harbour Bridge. That's why I banned her from driving. But see that quote there by Machiavelli? There's always our challenge, right? Machiavelli said, there is nothing more difficult or more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than the creation of a new system. For all initiators have the enmity of all who would profit by the preservation of the old system, and merely lukewarm defenders in those who would merely gain by the new one. That's the dilemma of reform. People who are benefiting from the current system are going to fight too hard. And those who are going to benefit from the new system, they're only lukewarm in their support. And we've got to be an organisation that tries to be initiators of a new system. And this is just a temporary setback. We have to think of plan B, and we will think of plan B. But understanding that those who will gain by the new one, you can't rely on their support. You've got to fight for them as well, right? Even though they won't fight for it, you've got to fight for them, because it will benefit them at the end of the day. So we've got to regather, we've got to strengthen, we've got to understand that we're going to hit some headwinds, but nevertheless we're striving towards a plan B. And I just want to say I had the best fun with Kerry Hall. It was we went through the darkest nights, you know, and she was good fun to be with. So thank you, everyone. Keep our eyes upwards. My rule, never shed a tear. Don't look back. But let's think about what plan B is. Thanks.
But I don't think that we could actually gather here without Kerry and Noel acknowledging, Noel, your leadership. We're so proud that you're the founder of our organisations. I know, trying to keep that rule, don't shed a tear. We all know how vulnerable I can be. I think what's really important is every single conversation I've had with somebody in here, or our mob in particular from Cape York, they couldn't be more proud of the work and in particular of you and your leadership. Everyone knows what this has come at a cost for you personally and your family and what that means. And I think we can't thank you enough. And words are one thing, but I hope that you feel our love and support. And we know that we'll continue. We need you. You know, we need you to do the work in the system, because while we have you, we have the courage to do anything that we're asked to do. And I think that's what I will end on. Thank you.